That's it. Okay. Right. I'm going to talk to you about lichens. I kind of fell into lichens by accident. I started out learning about fungi, started volunteering at the Queensland Herbarium about 12 years ago now, 10 years ago now. And just in the last couple of years, they've asked if I would start helping with their lichens. So I am now learning lots about lichens, and I'm going to pass on some of what I've learned to you tonight. So before I begin, hands up those of you who have actually looked really closely at a lichen. Okay, that's really good to see. Quite a few hands went up in the group. Most people don't, which is a shame, as lichens really are amazing things, and quite frankly, our lives actually wouldn't be the same without them. Next slide, please. Now, I have to admit that that is a pretty big statement about something which is so often overlooked and poorly understood. So what makes lichens so important? To understand that, we first need to understand what they are. Next slide, please. Okay, now I am very tempted to say something, and I might actually say it today. I read a very good description about what lichens are from a book. And apparently a few years ago, I think his name's David Ainsborough, the gentleman who was behind the fungi, dictionary of the fungi, they were trying to put a little line in their dictionary, what are lichens? And the best he could come up with is something that lichenologists study. So, because they're very difficult things to describe. So I will start at the beginning. In the very early days of science, all living things were classified. Now back to the animals, please. Sorry, Wayne, could you go back a slide? Back, thank you. In the very early days of science, all living things were classified into two groups or kingdoms. And this division goes back at least as far as Aristotle, a Greek man who lived about 2,300 years ago. He distinguished between plants, which don't move about from place to place, and animals which do. So that's a pretty obvious distinction. But even with this extremely basic understanding, it was obvious that lichens weren't animals, and as they didn't move about, so they therefore had to be plants. Next one. Over time, Aristotle's observations were slowly expanded upon by others. It was generally agreed that plants don't move about from place to place, they make their own food, and they reproduce via seeds or spores. This broad description still seemed to fit lichens, and so for many hundreds of years, lichens were thought to be simple or lower plants like the mosses and liverworts. Next one, please. Now, this conclusion is quite understandable, especially when you look at a lichen like this one. As you can see, it's green like a leaf, it has leaf-like lobes, and these round pink things look a little bit like weird flowers. So it wasn't until the early 1700s, when scientists started using microscopes to examine cellular structures, that they realised that lichens actually aren't plants. Well, not exactly. Their true nature wasn't discovered until 1867. Now, these days, scientists are using DNA sequencing and phylogenetic analysis to study lichens. And even with these advanced technologies, we're still only scratching at the surface at what these remarkable organisms are. Next slide. There we go. You see, lichens are complicated things. They aren't a single organism. They are a collection of organisms living closely together in a symbiotic relationship. Their main components are a fungus and either a green algae or a cyanobacteria. Now, for a long time, lichens have been referred to as composite organisms, but recently, lichenologists, that's people who study lichens, have begun to refer to them instead as microecosystems. This is an acknowledgement of just how complicated lichens really are. So let's have a look at the different parts of a lichen. Most of a lichen's bulk, perhaps over 95% of it, is made up of a single multi-celled fungus. This is called the mycobiont, where myco means fungus and biont means organism. For a long time, it was thought that the relationship was one lichen, one fungus. But just a few years ago, it was discovered that many lichens actually also contain tiny single-celled fungi, yeasts. And some lichens actually contain 2 or more different kinds of yeast. The algal and cyanobacterial components of a lichen are called the photobionts, where photo means light. Green algae are tiny plants, and cyanobacteria are, as their name suggests, a kind of bacteria, which is another story entirely. Cyanobacteria are sometimes still referred to as blue-green algae, though algae and bacteria are very different things. All we need to know for now is that cyanobacteria can photosynthesize just like plants. That is, they use light to make their own food in the form of sugars. About 85% of lichens have algae as their photobiont, 10% have cyanobacteria, and the remaining 5% have both. Lichen often contain more than one species of algae or cyanobacterium. This can be very useful if changing conditions favour one photobiont over the other. Lichens also contain many other kinds of bacteria, lots and lots of bacteria. This particular lichen species has over 800 different kinds of bacteria associated with it. Next. Now, the fungi, algae, and bacteria in lichens all have been given their own scientific names, but the lichen as a whole is given the same name as its dominant fungal component. This is because it is this multi-celled fungus which forms the main structure of the lichen. So this lichen here is named after its main fungal component, Pulchrocladia retipora. Trabuxia is the most common green algal photobiont found in lichens. About 50% of all lichens have it. And I don't know what kind of yeast, if it has any, or bacteria, but it's most likely that it does have yeast, and it most likely, definitely does have other kinds of bacteria in it. Next one. Now, the algae and cyanobacteria species of lichens can and do live independently in nature. It's also possible to grow them separately in the laboratory. The results are healthy organisms that reproduce readily. However, the opposite isn't the case for the fungal partner. If it grows at all, the fungus is weak, sterile, and looks nothing like its lichen form. Experiments have also shown that lichenized fungal species can only survive in nature on their own for about a year. They have evolved to become totally dependent upon their partners. So why do these very different kinds of organisms live together? To answer this question, we first need to know a little bit about fungi. Like lichen, the early scientists thought that fungi were simple plants. Again, over time, we learned more and more about them and decided that fungi, they're not plants, but they certainly aren't animals either. Simply put, fungi are organisms that feed by external digestion and absorption, reproduce by spores, and have rigid cell walls that contain chitin. In 1969, fungi were reclassified and put into a kingdom of their own. And more recently, DNA analyses have shown that fungi are actually more closely related to animals than plants. Now, it's this feature, that fungi feed by digestion and absorption, that is of most interest to us here. When most people think of a fungus, they think of a mushroom like this one. It's got a cap and gills and a stalk. But it doesn't end there. For this mushroom, and for many other kinds of fungi, the brackets and the corals and the puffballs and so forth that we QMS people like to look at, well, it's what lies beneath them that's important. Many of you will know what this is. The mushrooms are just the fungus's fruiting bodies. You might have heard them described as being like the apples on a tree. The actual body of the fungus organism is made up of hyphae, cylindrical, thread-like structures that are much narrower than the width of a human hair and can be up to several meters in length. As the hyphae grow, they branch and occasionally join with other hyphae, forming a net-like mycelium, such as the one pictured here. This mycelium is hidden away underneath the mushroom, growing through the fungus's food source, dissolving it and feeding on it as it goes. Its food source is called the substrate. Now, fungi eat all kinds of things. Many of them feed on other organisms, such as plants and animals, and even other fungi. When the organism is dead, the fungus is a decomposer or rotter. When the organism is alive, the fungus is said to be parasitic. And if the fungus causes death or causes disease or even death, it's pathogenic. And then there are those fungi which have beneficial relationships with other living organisms, such as the ones that have special partnerships with plants. Some of these fungi live in the soil and attach themselves to the roots of plants. The fungus gives the plant water, so the plant gets more water than its roots alone could provide, and that's a real benefit in dry situations. Fungi can also draw minerals such as nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil, something that plants aren't very good at. In return, the plant gives the fungus sugars that the fungus can't make, but needs to survive. This symbiotic relationship is called mycorrhizal association, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that. So you can probably guess where I'm going with this. The fungi in lichen have taken this relationship with plants much, much further. Yes. So think of lichens as tiny farms where a fungus is growing crops to produce the sugar it needs. This is a very common analogy that people give. The mycelium is the infrastructure holding together and protecting the algae and cyanobacteria within its network of hyphae. With its relatively much larger surface area, the fungus not only protects its photobionts, it also provides them with water and nutrients that it gathers from the air, much more than they would if they were living alone, a bit like the trees and the mycorrhizal fungi. Next one. As for the yeast components, they are thought to produce chemicals that act as a sunscreen, help the lichen ward off predators, and repel microbes. And that's probably thought because they've been mostly found in the top layer of the lichen. Next one. The bacteria are also thought to defend against pathogens, as well as supply vitamins and minerals, provide resistance to variations in temperature and humidity, and poisons such as heavy metals. In return, the phytobionts produce sugars, which the fungi and bacteria feed on. And it's a surprising amount of sugar. It's usually about 50% of what the photobionts, produce is given away. So that's a lot. And they just leak it. The hyphae in the fungus hyphae don't actually penetrate the cells. All they have to do is wrap it. So they're not harming the algae or cyanobacteria. Next one. Some cyanobacteria provide not only sugars, but they can also fix or gather nitrogen from the atmosphere, converting it to a form that plants can access. The algae components of the lichen benefit from this extra nitrogen, and in turn, so does everything else. It's been shown that lichens in northern New Zealand, Nothofagus forests, can produce up to 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. This lichen has a nostoc species as its photobiont. Nostoc is the most common cyanobacterium found in lichen and is also known to have a symbiotic relationship with some plants. So, next one. The relationship between mycobionts and the photobionts is traditionally thought to be mutualistic because of its stability. All the components survive and prosper. However, this isn't always the case. Like some of their distant fungal cousins, there are some lichens where the relationship is not so balanced. They may be commensalistic, where the fungi benefit from the photobionts, but the photobionts get very little in return, or parasitic, where the fungi benefit and the photobionts are actually harmed, sometimes even to the point of death, which is a bit of a strange thing. They do it. Next one. So, when did this complicated relationship first begin? Fossils from southern China show that lichen-like organisms were living on land about 500 to 600 million years ago. Now, dinosaurs first appeared about 240 million years ago. So lichens existed way before there were any dinosaurs. For a long time, it was also thought that lichens were some of the first organisms to live on dry land, that they paved the way for the plants and animals. You might have heard that. But recent studies have actually shown that they most likely evolved on land with or after, but not before the vascular plants. So the first lichens would have shared the land with simple plants such as mosses and liverworts, and more complex plants such as ferns and horsetails. Now, some really big fossils of a strange kind of organism, up to 420 million years old, have been found in places all over the world. Some have even been dug up in Queensland. The organisms have been named Prototaxides, and so far about a dozen different species have been identified. What they are have been a puzzle for some time, but the general consensus now is that they are fungal in nature, and some scientists believe that Prototaxides could even be ancient lichens. These lichens, if they indeed were lichens, were giants, standing over 6 metres tall and about 1 metre wide at the base. At that time, I think the tallest plant was about 1 metre high at the most, so Prototaxides would have dominated the landscape. Fossil evidence suggests that lichens have evolved at least 5 times from different fungal lineages, so lichens have no common ancestor. Because this convergent evolution has happened so many times, the lichenization of fungi is viewed as a highly successful nutritional strategy. And that answers the question as to why these organisms choose to live together. It works, and it works pretty well. Okay, how many different kinds of lichens are there? Well, so far, worldwide, about 20,000 species have been formally described and given names. Over 3,000, perhaps 4,000, I read somewhere, of those are found in Australia. Next slide. Now, it's been estimated that there are 2.5 million different species of fungi. So far, only about 155,000 of those have been described and named, and that's including the 20,000 lichenized species. So if we do the math, that means that there are a lot more lichens out there waiting to be discovered. And by the way, all those many thousands of lichenized fungi species are associated with only 300 or 400 different photobiont species. Next. Where do lichens live? And the simple answer to that is just about everywhere. It has been estimated that as much as 8% of the Earth's land surface is covered by lichens. They have been found on every single continent, from both polar regions to the equator. They live in the wettest jungles and the driest deserts, on the highest mountain peaks and below the coastal tide line. Yes, there are even marine and freshwater lichens. Experiments have shown that lichens can even survive the exposure to the vacuum and intense radiation of space, not just for a few minutes or hours or even days, but up to 1.5 years. Next one. So how do they do that? Some lichens are really, really tough. The trick is they dry out as their surroundings dry out, and they enter a state of metabolic suspension, kind of like how some animals go into a hibernation. Because their life processes virtually stop, this allows them to tolerate extremes of temperature and high radiation levels. Lichens such as these aptly named resurrection lichens, an Australian species by the way, might look dead when they're all curled up and crispy dry, but they can be very quickly revived with just a splash of water. I timed some upstairs and it takes literally less than a minute for them to uncurl and the algae in them to turn green and to start photosynthesizing again. It's that quick. So I read somewhere that the actual respiration starts literally within a second or two of getting wet, and the photosynthesizing starts within a minute. Even the toughest lichens need some water and light to survive. Water is easy. Lichens can get enough just by absorbing the humidity from the air. Who needs rain? As for light, lichens have to grow in places where there is enough light for their photobionts to be able to photosynthesize. This means they have to grow on the surface of things, their substrate, to be able to access it. By the way, when a lichenologist talks about a lichen substrate, they're talking about what it is growing on, not what it's eating. Almost anything can be a substrate. Things like barks, leaves, rocks, bricks, concrete, metal, glass, plastic, and even the shell of this Galapagos tortoise. Next. Some lichens live in the very upper layer of soil. They form thin crusts, literally only millimeters thick, and they bind the soil together, preventing erosion and helping with water retention. In semi-arid and desert areas, these lichens, together with the mosses and free-living fungi, algae, and cyanobacteria, form what are called biological soil crusts. Biocrusts have a critical role to play in harsh environments. That's too much to go into here. What I will say is that they are extremely fragile, especially when they're dry. Just walking on them can destroy them. So when you're out west and you see a biological crust, please don't walk on it. Keep off the lichens. Next. Now, lichens also like to grow on rocks. Unfortunately, they can't tell the difference between a natural rock out in the bush or one that's been deliberately shaped. Things like statues, gravestones, monuments, walls, and roofs. And this can be a big problem for us humans. Lichens can obscure details such as text and look really untidy. Worse still, studies have shown that lichens can cause significant weathering on some stone surfaces in a pretty short time. However, other studies have shown that lichens can also, strangely enough, protect the stone surfaces they're growing on by sheltering them from the wind and the rain. So their conclusion is that it's the abrasive methods needed to remove the lichens from our stone artefacts which causes the most damage. So the debate is ongoing on how to best preserve stone objects of cultural significance. The Mount Rushmore was cleaned once, to my knowledge. It would have cost billions of dollars, but the company doing it did it for free. Since then, the American government has decided it's not worth it, and they'll just let their presidents grow beards, lichen beards. Next. So where we don't find lichens is important too. Lichens pretty much get all their nutrients from the air and rain. Unfortunately, they absorb the bad along with the good. So atmospheric pollutants, especially sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, are a big problem for them. Some lichens can tolerate pollution better than others, but those that can't won't grow in polluted areas. As a result, many of our cities are lichen deserts. The presence and absence of certain key species can indicate the levels of pollution, and this has been used as a means of monitoring air quality since as far back as 1859. Lichens are also being used to monitor radioactive contamination in places such as Chernobyl and Fukushima. Yes, along with heavy metals such as lead, cadmium, zinc, lichens can also absorb and concentrate in their tissues radioactive isotopes of elements such as cesium and strontium. Next. Even though they are made up of some vastly different organisms, just like all other living things, lichens grow, reproduce, react to their environment, sometimes get sick, and they eventually die. So first of all, let's have a look at how lichens grow. So we've got a few different shapes here. And the body, all these different shapes, you see the body of the lichen is called the thallus. How the thallus grows is affected by the different components of the lichen organised within it. So the resulting shape is controlled by the different species of fungi and algae or cyanobacteria which are involved. They can take an amazing array of different shapes, some of which you can see here. And in that same book I was reading this today, they actually talked about what they call chimeric lichens, where you've got same fungus associating with two different photobionts. So parts of the lichen's thallus were one shape and colour, and the other part a totally different shape and colour, but it was all the same lichen. So how's that? Okay, Next. Some lichen thalli are flat and attached very firmly to their substrate, forming thin crusts. These are, not surprisingly, called crustose lichens. The yeast and phytobionts lie in layers just beneath the surface of the lichen's skin, its upper cortex. Some crustose lichens have a layer of tiny little structures on their underside called rhizomes, which penetrate the substrate, making it absolutely impossible to see the lower surface of the lichen. Rhizomes actually might look like roots, but they're not. Unlike plant roots, they don't absorb nutrients or moisture. They only act as anchors. Next. Foliose lichens have thalli which are flat, leaf-like, and the ends of which may lift up and away from the surface of the substrate. The internal structure of these foliose lichens is similar to that of crusts, but they also have a distinct skin on the underside of the lobes, and that's called the lower cortex. They also have some rhizomes, but fewer than crusts, and they often have bare areas on the lower cortex, which allow parts of the lobes to lift away from the substrate. And one easy way to tell if a lichen is a crust or if it's foliose is if you can get your fingernail under its edge. If you can, it's foliose, and if you can't, it's a crust. And believe me, if you're out collecting lichens, when you're collecting crusts, you have to take them with their substrate. There is absolutely no way you can get them off a rock or a piece of bark. Next. And you might have seen lichens that look a bit like this one. They're tendrils that are round in cross-section, and they have no distinguishable upper or lower surface. As a result, they are hair-like or shrub-like in shape. And these lichens are often found dangling from or sitting upright on tree branches and fence posts. Lichens of this shape are called fruticose lichens. By the way, the word fruticose has nothing to do with fruit. It comes from the Latin word frutex, which means shrub. So it's because they look like little bushes. And there are other shapes as well, but these are the three main ones that people talk about. Next. The way some lichens grow is crucial to the creation of new soils. As crustose lichens grow on rocks, like the ones pictured here in Girraween National Park, their rhizomes put pressure on the rock's surface and slowly pull the grains apart. Also, acidic chemicals that lichens create as metabolic byproducts can gradually eat away at the rock, dissolving the fine particles. And all this is a part of a process called biological weathering. Remember the concern about lichens growing on statues and gravestones? So given enough time, the lichens would eventually turn them into soil. So imagine in a couple of 100,000 years, Mount Rushmore will be a plain. Okay. And oh yes, and as a final touch, when the lichens die, they contribute organic matter and nitrogen to nourish the soil they have helped to create. Next. How long do lichens live? Okay. Most lichens grow between 1 and 4 millimetres a year. Now, that's pretty slow. But some fruticose lichens living in very humid climates, such as Florida, can grow up to 0.5 metre in a year. But on the whole, most lichens grow very, very slowly. And by measuring these rates of growth, lichenologists have been able to estimate the ages of some lichens living in the European Alps to be over 10,000 years old. Considering the fact that these lichens might not even grow for most of the years due to the harsh environment, they might be quite a lot older. Some estimates have been as much as 50,000 years. I photographed these bright orange lichens up in the Swiss Alps a few years ago, and some of them were pretty large. So I can only wonder how old they are. Next. The orange colour of some lichens, this is an orange one that grows locally, so you don't have to go to the Swiss Alps to see those, is a special pigment which is believed to screen out UV light. Some lichen pigments can block out as much as 50% of light, which sounds a bit strange for something that's supposed to need light to survive. So why do they do this? As we humans know, there is such a thing as getting too much sunlight. And this is particularly so for organisms that live in very exposed places or high altitudes. And so this ability to produce a sunscreen is very, very important, especially for the lichens that have trabecusia as their photobiont. Remember, about 50% of lichens have trabecusia, and trabecusia actually prefers a low light environment. So there you go. Next. Most lichens you can see are fairly drab though when they're dry. And this is the colour of the dominant fungus, which is basically just a grey or a white colour. However, when a lichen gets wet, the fungus becomes translucent and the colour of the photobionts lying just beneath the cortex shows through. So algae are typically bright fresh greens, while cyanobacteria are dark greens, blue greens, browns, greys, or even black. So from this bright fresh green colour here, I'd say that all the lichens in these photos have an algae in them. Cool. And lichens can also surprise us in different way when it comes to their colours. The chemicals in a lichen's thallus can make some species fluoresce spectacularly under UV light. We don't know why they do this. It's not bioluminescence, as they aren't actually producing light, so they don't glow in the dark. They are just reflecting different wavelengths of light in response to the UV. These lichens were photographed under normal lighting. Let's now have a look at how they look under UV. So as you can see, they're quite different. And lichens can glow in a variety of colours. Yellow is the most common, but some fluoresce orange, pink, red, purple, and blue. So I love that one that's purple with the little blue dots. And I brought my UV torch tonight and a little lichen. So just to prove that that's not a bit of photoshopping, for those who might not have seen it in real life, this is just a normal grey lichen. Hopefully we can see it in, you see? So if I shine my, you should see, it's fluorescing bright yellow. So this is actually one of the things lichenologists use to help identify lichen, whether they react to UV light, which is very handy and easy to do. Okay, next. So the next question is a big one. How does a microecology reproduce? Next. The algae and cyanobacteria can reproduce sexually when living independently. But when they get within a lichen, this ability is chemically suppressed by the fungus. So when they're in a lichen, they can only reproduce asexually by simple cell division. Only the fungal part of the lichen organism is able to reproduce sexually, and they do this much like other fungi, but instead of producing a mushroom to release its spores, the most lichenized fungi produce other structures. The most easily recognizable of these structures are the little cups and discs often seen growing on the top of the thallus. I'm sure many of you who have looked at your lichens will have seen little things like that. And they're called apothecia. Sometimes the cup shape is bulged outwards to form little buttons and blobs, as you can see here. So some of them get quite big. Apothecia can be embedded quite deeply in the thallus of the lichen or raised high above it on tall stalks called podetia, again shown in the right-hand image. Next. So remember prototaxis? It's thought to be a podetia of an ancient lichen. Next. Now, the fungal spores develop inside special cells called asci that are located just beneath the surface of the apothecia. So when mature, the asci break open at the top and the spores are released into the air. Should a spore land and germinate near a free-living photobiont, the baby fungus will capture within its network of hyphae and start a new lichen. Some spores might actually be lucky enough to land and germinate near an already established young lichen. In that case, if they are compatible, the baby fungus will fuse with the other lichen and there'll actually be a battle for who gets the photobiont. And so this process of reproduction relies a lot upon chance. Remember, if the baby fungus doesn't find a partner within a year or so, it will die. And there has to be a better way. And fortunately, there is. Many lichens also reproduce asexually from fragments that break away from the thallus. Each piece that breaks off contains both the fungus and the photobiont, and sorry, I lost my spot, and can grow into new lichen. This process is called vegetative reproduction. It's thought that this is why so many lichens have such delicate growth forms and get brittle when they dry. Frilly lobes, frilly bits, narrow lobes and fine strands break apart more easily than robust thalli. Wind and rain distribute the pieces, but sometimes animals do too. Pieces can easily get caught on passing feet and fur and feathers and carried away. Some of our local birds, such as this eastern yellow robin here, deliberately break off and carry away pieces of lichen to camouflage their nests. And I'm sure along the way, some of the bits of the lichen get dropped by accident and fall in a tree and start growing there. Next. Yep. Some lichens go even further and grow special structures on their surfaces just for the purposes of breaking off. These tiny fragile structures are called ceridia and ascidia. Ceridia are fluffy little puffballs, basically, powdery tangles of fungal and photobiont cells that form on the surface or edge of the thallus. Ascidia are like little fingers. They're stalked out growths growing up from the thallus. They may be simple pegs or more complex coral-like structures. And all these things are things that lichenologists look at to help identify their lichen. Next. But what's this? What did I say about lichens not producing mushrooms? There are, of course, always exceptions to the rules. This lichen, and this is the lichen here, this fuzzy green stuff that you might think is an algae is actually a lichen. It's the thallus. And it produces a gilled mushroom when its fungus wants to reproduce. So some people think that this is a lichen that's or a fungus that's very, very early in the stage of turning into a lichen. Whether it is, maybe it just likes keeping the mushroom. So next. Now, as I mentioned before, some lichen produce their spores inside a special cell called an ascus. Now, you might know that fungi that produce asci are known as ascomycetes. That's about 98% of lichenized fungi are ascomycetes. Other fungi produce their spores on the ends of special cells called basidia. These fungi are called basidiomycetes. Most of the larger fungi we see in the bush are basidiomycetes, and so is our yellow mushroom-producing lichen. Only about 2% of lichenized fungi are basidiomycetes. But the yeasts, strangely, that live inside a lot of lichen are also basidiomycetes, but yeasts don't produce mushrooms. They reproduce asexually by budding. Next. So now I think it's about the right time we get back to this lichen. And we'll sum up what we've learned about lichen. We know that the leafy-looking part is the lichen's thallus. It has lobes that lift away from the substrate, so we can call it a foliose lichen. The fresh green colour is produced by the lichen's photobionts. And because it's such a fresh green colour, we could safely assume that it's an algae, not a cyanobacteria. These little delicate frilly bits are the lichen's vegetative reproductive structures. And the strange pink things that look a bit like flowers aren't flowers at all. They're the apothecia. And because it has apothecia, we know that the dominant fungus of this lichen is an ascomycete. And finally, we know that the entire lichen was named after the dominant fungus, I'll try to say it, Pseudocyphalaria glabra. So all your knowledge put into one. Okay, that was a very nice, healthy looking lichen. Some of them aren't so lucky. And this poor one isn't looking very good at all. Some lichens might live for a very long time, but they don't live forever. They're mortal just like the rest of us, and they face similar trials in life. Lichens can get sick, and like us, they're very susceptible to a large range of diseases, including bacterial, viral, and fungal. Next. And there are a lot of dangers out there. When you think about it, lichens are very vulnerable. They can't run away and hide. The only thing they can do is stay and fight. Lichens, as a survival tactic, have evolved a chemical arsenal which protects them against a variety of dangers, such as parasites, pathogens, and even other lichens. And like all organisms, lichens compete with each other for food. More territory means a greater surface area in which to gather more light and to make more food. So some lichens fight for their territory by leaching poisons that ward off foreign invaders. In these photos, the black lines you can see between the different crustose species are the no-go areas where a fierce chemical combat is going on. So basically, you've got what's called the prothallus, which is kind of like the underlying fungal organism that doesn't have any of the important parts like the algae in it, and that goes out, and it chemicals happen, and they sense that there's the other lichen there. So that's why there's this like a dead area where neither lichen is willing to commit its growth area. It's algae and that. So that's why there's these black lines. Okay. So plants are also considered a threat, as they can be a significant competition for light. Some lichens actually produce chemicals which can inhibit the growth of mosses and even prevent the seeds of larger plants from growing. Next. And now we come to the final chapter on the life of a lichen, death. And there are many causes of death for lichens. It may be malnutrition or starvation, dehydration, disease, poisoning, predation, terminal injury, or simply old age. One of the biggest causes of death is, of course, being eaten by animals. Even though lichens are poor in nutrients and proteins, some large mammals, such as reindeer and caribou, are well known for surviving on them during the harsh northern hemisphere winters. A single reindeer can eat up to 5 kilograms of lichen in just one day. Other mammals that are known to eat lichens are gazelle, goats, camels, llamas, lemmings, and squirrels. And in Australia, some of our gliders are known to feed on them. Next. One of the more unusual animals that eat lichens is the Christmas Island red crab. Next. Lots of smaller animals also consume lichens. These include slugs and snails, termites, grasshoppers, and the caterpillars of many butterflies and moths. Apparently, a lot of moths and butterflies need lichens to survive on. Now, surprising, this isn't all bad for the lichen. The animals move on and their fecal droppings spread undigested bits of lichen to new places, along with a little bit of fertilizer to help them along the way. Many of these creatures are coloured so that they are camouflaged against the lichen thalli. They've been living amongst lichens for so long that they have evolved to look like them. Others, such as case moths, simply cover themselves with fragments of lichen. This photo is of a wonderfully adapted spiny leaf insect that's actually found in Queensland. So if we keep our eyes open, we might get to see one. Next. Now, fire, of course, kills lichens. Those that survive the flames aren't as lucky as you might think. After a fire, the forest structure becomes more open. Species that can't tolerate the change in light and levels in humidity will die. But other species more suited to the more open environment will eventually move in. See, some lichens are so highly sensitive to their particular environment that if, say, the rock they're living on should slide down a slope where it gets less light, it will die. So that's why when people try to transplant lichens from one location to another, it's sometimes unsuccessful. The new environment simply isn't suitable. It might not be humid enough. It might not get enough sunlight, or it might be too humid or too much sunlight. Next. So why do we need lichens? We need them because plants and animals need them. Next. Plants need lichens because lichens break down rocks to make soil. Lichens crusts help stabilise soil and retains moisture content. Lichens fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and release it into the soil in a form that plants can use. And when they die, lichens add further nutrients and organic matter to the soil. Next. Animals need lichens because the plants they eat need lichens. They eat the lichens. Their prey might eat the lichens. They might use lichens as camouflage or for protection. And lichens might be their home. Next. Now, humans have needed lichens for many of the same reason as other animals need lichens. For instance, we eat them. In some cultures around the world, lichens are considered a staple food, and others a delicacy, while others consider them a food of last resort. Lichens can be made into a porridge, used as a flavouring or texture in stews, soups and salads, or ground into a flour and baked as bread or a cake. Okay, hands up those of you who have recently eaten a good Indian curry. Yep, okay. Chances are your curry powder had a lichen in it. It's used as a traditional flavouring for curries. And finally, lichens are used in some alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, so we drink them too. And if you're wanting to know how much nutrient lichens have, I read that they're about a little bit better than cornflakes. So about the same nutrient level, bit better than cornflakes. Next. Now, some people eat the animals that eat lichens, and this can lead to serious health problems. The Scandinavian Sami people and North American Eskimo are dependent upon the meat of the reindeer and caribou, which, as I mentioned before, basically survive on lichens. But many of the lichens that these animals consume have been affected by modern pollution, and they've absorbed heavy metals and, worse still, sometimes even radioactive isotopes. So the reindeer and caribou accumulate high concentrations in their bodies, and this poison in turn is passed on to the people who eat them. So that's becoming a problem in some areas. Next. And on the topic of poisons, the Norwegians used to use this particular lichen, which naturally produces high levels of volcanic acid to kill wolves and foxes. They would lay out the carcasses of animals stuffed with the lichen and ground up glass as bait. And it's since been shown that the toxins in the lichen alone would have been enough just to kill the animals. They didn't need the glass. Next. On the flip side, we've also been using lichens as medicines for a very long time. Now, this particular lichen, the same one with the 800 bacteria in it, is still used today as a herbal remedy in many countries. It's used to treat conditions such as asthma, eczema, and as an antiseptic. Scientists have discovered over 1,000 chemical compounds from cultures of lichenized fungi. Some include those that have light protective, antibacterial, anti-tumor, anti-inflammatory, and antioxidant properties. So a great many lichens, perhaps 50% of them, have antibiotic properties. Usnic acid is one of the strongest antibiotics lichens produce. And these days it is used commercially in mouthwashes, toothpastes, deodorants, shampoos, and even sunscreens. Next. And interestingly, the microfungus penicillium, which is, as you know, used to make the antibiotic penicillin, is believed to evolve from an earlier lichenized form. So there you go. Lichens aren't just static, they are evolving, and some of them are going back to their original form. Next. Now, lichens have also provided us with scents for perfumes and cosmetics for thousands of years. The two major lichens that are used commonly are known as tree moss and oak moss. Until only recently in some parts of Europe, commercial collecting of lichens for the perfume and aftershave industry was still going strong, particularly in France. In 1997, approximately 1,900 tonnes was collected from the wild. In 2017, the EU published a regulation banning the use of lichens in cosmetic products. Not because they were worried that the populations of lichens were going extinct from over-collecting, but because they were concerned that the lichen-based products in the resulting fragrances were causing allergic reactions in about 3% of the people who were using them. Next. Lichens have also provided us with colourful dyes for wool, silk and other fabrics since ancient times. Perhaps the most well-known of the lichens, collectively known as the cudbear lichens. These were the sources of the bright red and some of the purple dyes, or the cheaper purple dyes, used by the ancient Greeks and Romans. The trade in lichens for dyes was massive in Europe for a very, very long time. It was a big business and it was devastating to the local lichens, particularly when dye making was mechanised. There are 18th century records of French dye makers having to import lichens from Germany because their local supplies had been exhausted. And the overgathering situation in Britain was so bad that the naturalist Charles Darwin was tasked to look for new sources of suitable lichens during his voyages. Next. Sadly, overgathering of lichens is still very much a problem in some parts of the world. The Himalayan region, including Nepal and Yunnan in China, is currently the biggest hotspot, and it is of enormous concern to the environmentalists and economists. The practice simply isn't sustainable, not for the lichens nor for the poor country folk who collect them. The whole area is being stripped of its lichens, and it's strongly suspected that a number of endemic species are going extinct. On top of that, many trees are being badly damaged by the stripping process. In 2011, Nepal actually banned collecting lichens on a commercial scale, but despite this, there is still a huge illegal trade in lichens going on between Nepal and India. Next. Worldwide, the general public is also being heavily discouraged from collecting lichens. Hobbyists, such as those who like to make their own natural dyes, are making an effort to collect in a responsible way. That is to only take lichens from timber that's been cut for burning or from fallen branches and bits of bark, and only take enough for what they need. Now that sounds pretty good, but remember, fallen lichen is very much a part of the nutrient cycle of the forest. And how much is enough? One big bowlful of lichens makes one colour for a limited amount of cloth or yarn. Now, I don't think many hobbyists would stop after making just one colour on dyeing one skein of yarn. And more lichen means a stronger or brighter colour. So you can see it would be, I need more, I need more. So the amount of lichens needed to make the dyes for a woolen scarf or hat may represent decades or perhaps 100 more or more years of growth. Remember, lichens grow very slowly. They're not going to grow back in a hurry. So I have to ask, is the scarf or hat that you're dyeing really worth it? If everybody goes out and dyes their hat or scarf from your local forest, where are your lichens going? Next. So farming lichens would solve a lot of these problems. So why aren't we? Well, I just said it. The main reason is because lichens grow so slowly. The cycle of growth and harvest would be uneconomical for industry. However, there are actually some people who are trying to grow lichens, not to make a profit, but to revegetate forests that have been burned out by wildfires. And these forests are in Canada, and they're home to an endangered species of caribou, which, as I've said repeatedly before, they eat lichens. They survive on them over winter. And anyway, this group of researchers are carefully transplanting fragments of the lichens and studying their growth. The project has been going on for about 6 years now, And even though it's been very small scale, and I'm just talking square meters here, it's been very, very promising. But I don't know how the recent fires this year have affected it. I don't know if they're in that area or not. Next. So now protecting the Great Barrier Reef, saving the whales or a rare and beautiful orchid are all equally noble causes and are generally accepted. But mentioning that you also want to save the lichens tends to raise a few eyebrows. I'm sure you get that. Well, we get that when we say we want to save the mushrooms. Try saying we want to save the lichens. You get even both eyebrows going up. But as I have shown you this evening, lichens are very important and they're just as vulnerable as the whales. So what can we do? If you think about it, most of it's just common sense. Like us, lichens need clean air and water and a safe place to live. We need to ensure that they continue to have those precious things. We obviously need to reduce the amount of pollutants that are in our air, water, and soil. But we also need to protect our lichens from the overuse of fertilizers and fungicides, not only in agriculture and forestry, but in our own gardens as well. We need to conserve the places where they live, the forests and the wild places. We need to protect them from overexploitation and being gathered into extinction. And the microhabitats, those little places in parks and gardens, they're also very important to preserve. Leave that patch of lichens on your tree or your fence. It's not doing anything. It's not harming anything. In fact, it's doing your garden good. And finally, then there's the big one, climate change. And that just affects everything. So to help lichens survive, we also need to learn more about them. Not only about all those undiscovered species, but ordinary common species as well. And so much of what they are and what they do is still so poorly understood. Remember, what is a lichen? It's something like an ologist study. All around the world, there are organisations, large and small, professional and non-professional, and they're all dedicated to learning about lichens, and these are just a few of them. So I'm proud to say the Queensland Mycological Society is getting behind lichens. Next. So what can you as an individual do? The next time you come across a lichen, stop a moment and look at it. Think about what I've said. If you're with someone, don't be embarrassed or shy. Point it out to them and talk about it. Spread the word. Raise the awareness. Lichens truly are amazing, and our world really wouldn't be the same without them. So for those of you who might be interested in learning more about lichens, these two booklets can be borrowed from our library, and they can be also downloaded for free from the QMS website. Thank you. Have we got any questions? Yep. I will do so. Okay. I'm not sure, what's your name? Connor. He's just asked, he's got some lichen growing on his wooden garden furniture, and he's wanting to know if it's harming the furniture or protecting it. That's a good question. And that comes back to what I was saying about the statues in Mount Rushmore and that. Some people would say it's harming it in that it's providing a humid layer, you might say, which is letting other fungi survive and attack the wood. Other fungi rot it, so that might help it rot the wood faster. But then again, it could be protecting the wood because it's protecting it from the sunshine and the weather. So it's up to you whether you want to keep it there or not. I personally would, because I just love looking at lichens. So yeah. Does that answer your question? Right. Any other questions? Richard? Okay, the quickest growing one is that one I was talking about, I think in Florida. I think it's an Usnea species, which are those long, the dangly ones I was showing you, the fruticose ones. And because they live in such a high, humid, wet climate, they're basically getting everything they need continually, and that's why they can grow so much. The main thing that controls the rate of speed of growth for a lichen is how much water and how much it gets, basically. So if it lives something that lives in a dry climate, you know it will be growing very, very slowly. Yes. Yep. Okay. From Warwick, how do lichen taxonomists name lichens when two lichens have the same fungal partner but different algal partners? They're actually called the same thing, but they're given different form names. So it would be blah, blah, the lichen, former, and then they'd have the algal form, cyanobacterium form, so or whichever algal Trigbuxia form, and then the other form. So hopefully that answers your question. Penelope, you said there are always exceptions to the rule. Yes, there are some lichens that grow quickly. Like I said, there's that Usnea one. I'm sure some people would say that some of the ones growing on their solar panels also tend to grow very quickly. But when you think about it, they're up there in the light and getting all the water, so they're in a prime position. They'll be growing faster. I was reading something about lichens also have a growth spurt when they're young. So they will tend to grow faster when they're young, and as they get older, they'll slow down. So hopefully that answers your question. Oh, thank you. Oh, okay, Patty Mullen. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, there's a little thing I was reading about when I was reading about those Canadian people who were trying to grow their lichens. They had this little thing between them where they have lichen lollipops for the reindeer, sticks with clusters of lichens on them that the reindeer would pick up and chew. And what else have we got? Any more questions? Any questions from here? Yes? Right. So what's your name? Sorry. Louise asked basically about what animals, Australian animals eat lichens, and what would be the impact on Australian animals if we should lose our lichens. Well, as I said, lichens are pretty much at the base of the food chain. A lot of insects eat lichens. So a lot of our Australian insects and butterflies, especially butterflies and moths, are dependent upon lichens. Larger animals, I knew about the gliders. That was the only thing I could find about Australian animals. And Catherine's just mentioned the pattymellon. So that's very, very interesting. But I don't know if much research has actually gone into what species. I'm sure someone has somewhere, but I haven't come across it yet. So if anybody out there is reading a paper about Australian animals eating lichens, I'd like to know. Okay. An extension to the question was a threatened species. Are there any threatened species of lichen in Australia? Not that I am aware of, because not enough study has gone. We just don't know what's out there. It's like our fungi. So many are undiscovered, or we know about them and they haven't been described or named. So we're not aware of what is out there. We don't know what is going extinct. So that's why what we're doing, and why I'm doing my best here to spread the word, is that lichens are important. We need to start collecting them. Like fungi, we need to know what's out there so that we can start mapping what's out there, seeing what's there in a time and place, and doing the same processes that people are doing for plants and fungi, to see what is going extinct, what needs them, what animals are dependent upon them, what birds are dependent upon them. Yep. Another question? Do lichens fragment? Well, from what I read, I don't know about going through a mammal or a bird. Depends on how fast their digestive system is, I suppose. It, I'd say probably not a ruminant like a cow or a horse that would chew it and well, you know, that. But from what they were saying, I was reading about insects, certainly things that have a faster digestive system. But larger animals, I'm not so sure. Yeah. Oh, you're welcome, Lou. Glad you enjoyed it. Yeah. Bob just saying some people are worried about a lot of lichens growing on their citrus trees, but he's read that when rains, the nitrogen comes out of the lichen and basically fertilizes the tree. Yeah, well, that's what I was saying about those nothofagus forests in New Zealand. I'm not sure if it actually washes out of them, but when the lichens die, that'd certainly be, it's possible. I should look into that. But I know definitely when the lichens die or bits break off and decompose, it'll definitely be adding nitrogen to the soil, which would be a benefit to the tree. So that's enough. Right. I'm
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you everyone online. And all right, so thank you everyone for coming tonight. And thank you, Vanessa, for that fascinating talk on lichens.